For 20 years, the phone never rang with his son's voice. Not once. Robert Miller, now in his late 60s, had grown used to the hollow quiet of his small home in Dayton, Ohio. His only child, David Miller, had cut him out of his life completely. No visits, no holiday cards, not even a reply to the dozens of voicemails Robert had left over the years. The break had begun 2 decades earlier. After Robert's bitter divorce from Linda Carter, his high school sweetheart turned relentless critic. The split, Linda had walked away with the family home, most of their savings, and worst of all, David's loyalty. Back then, David was 20, old enough to choose sides, and he chose his mother without hesitation. Robert remembered their last real conversation, David's words sharp with youthful certainty. Maybe if you'd worked harder, been more successful, none of this would have happened. Since then, birthdays passed in silence. Christmas mornings were spent alone. And the father-son bond that Robert once thought unbreakable was reduced to nothing more than faded. Photographs in a shoebox, it was the kind of wound time didn't heal. Robert had built his life back from the rubble, but a part of him still waited for the knock at the door, the unexpected call, the simple "Hey, Dad" that never came. Until one December evening when the phone finally rang, and this time it was David. The night David cut him off for good. Robert Miller sat alone in his empty apartment with the sound of Linda's final words still echoing in his head. "You've never been enough." The divorce had been swift and merciless. Linda, armed with a high-powered attorney, took the 3-bedroom colonial they'd lived in for 25 years, the savings account Robert had built penny by penny, and the better part of their friends. She even kept the golden retriever, Duke, saying David needed stability when in reality she wanted to erase Robert from the picture entirely. Robert, then 48, moved into a modest 2-bedroom rental on the edge of Dayton, Ohio. It had mismatched carpet, a leaky faucet in the kitchen, and a view of the grocery store's parking lot. He brought with him one recliner, a dining table from his parents' attic, and the few boxes Linda hadn't claimed. The silence in that apartment was heavy, almost physical. It pressed against him during winter evenings when the wind rattled. The thin windows and the phone sat still, untouched. But Robert had always been practical. A lifetime of working as an accountant had taught him that if you can't change the past, you can balance the ledger in the present. He threw himself into work-long hours at the firm, keeping the books for small businesses, filing taxes for people who couldn't afford the big CPA offices downtown. It kept his mind busy, but it didn't fill the hole his family had left. Then came 2008, the year most Americans remember as the start of the Great Recession. People were losing their jobs, their homes, their security. Headlines screamed about foreclosure rates climbing like floodwaters, and for sale signs popped up like weeds in neighborhoods Robert used to drive through with his family. But where others saw devastation, Robert saw an opportunity. Accountant's kind of opportunity one Thursday morning. While flipping through the Dayton Daily News over black coffee, he spotted a foreclosure listing, a 2-unit duplex on the south side of town for less than the price of a new pickup truck. It wasn't glamorous spieling paint, overgrown lawn, but Robert's mind immediately began running numbers. He knew the mortgage rates, the cost of repairs, the potential rent. The math added up. That afternoon, he drove over to look at it in person. Standing on the cracked sidewalk, he could see past the boarded-up windows and sagging porch. The structure had good bones, it needed work, but not the kind that scared him. When he approached the bank for a loan, the loan officer peered over her glasses and said, "Mr. Miller, are you sure about this?" "The market's unstable." Robert smiled faintly. "That's when you buy when everyone else is running." He signed the papers, investing every cent he had saved since the divorce, plus a small loan against his retirement account.
After
Work, he'd change into jeans and an old sweatshirt, toss a toolbox into the back of his beat-up Ford Ranger, and head straight to the duplex. There, under the glare of a work lamp, he scraped old wallpaper, patched drywall, and replaced rotten floorboards with his own hands. 6 months later, he had tenants, a young couple just starting out, grateful for a clean, affordable home. There, rent covered the mortgage with a small surplus, and Robert did what accountants do best: reinvested. Another property came next, then another. By 2015, he owned a dozen properties scattered across Dayton. They weren't flashy, mostly small duplexes in single-family homes, but they brought in steady income. He still lived in the same modest rental, drove the same reliable Chevy Impala, and wore the same old leather jacket from his 20s. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, everything had. Robert had built something lasting, one patient decision. At a time, he had no one to impress, no audience to clap for him, and maybe that was the secret. The loneliness hadn't disappeared. Christmases were still spent alone. The answering machine still held no messages from David, but Robert found satisfaction in knowing he'd rebuilt from nothing, and that quiet fortune, forged in the shadows of his own heartbreak, was about to collide with the phone call he'd never thought he'd get. It happened on a Saturday morning in late October. It's a kind of crisp Midwestern day when the air smells faintly of burning leaves. In football games, Robert Miller had stopped at a Speedway gas station on his way to check in on one of his rental properties. He bought a cup of black coffee, a glazed donut, and almost as an afterthought a Powerball ticket. He didn't play often, maybe once every few months, but the jackpot had rolled over so many times, it was making headlines. He slipped the ticket into his wallet and forgot about it until the following Wednesday night. When the winning numbers flashed across the TV screen while he was folding laundry, one by one, the numbers matched. All of them. Robert sat there with a clean t-shirt in his hands, staring at the screen, his heart thudding so loud it drowned out the announcer's voice. The next morning, the Dayton Daily News ran the headline: "Local man wins $15 million Powerball jackpot." A reporter had snapped a photo of Robert standing in front of the Ohio Lottery office, holding the oversized check and wearing the same old leather jacket he'd had since his 20s. The money was real taxes already accounted for, and it was wired into his account within days, almost immediately. The calls started. Old high school friends who hadn't spoken to him in years, distant cousins from Florida and California, even a former coworker who once told him he lacked ambition. They all wanted to catch up or grab coffee. Robert kept the conversations polite but short. He wasn't interested in explaining himself or his plans. And then, one evening in early December, his phone rang with the name he never thought he'd see again: David Miller. "Dad," David said, his voice carrying that mix of forced cheer and hesitation you hear from someone who knows they've been absent too long. "I know it's been a while, but Christmas is coming up, and Emily and I were talking. We'd love to have you over for dinner, family time." Family. Time. The words felt foreign in Robert's ears. He glanced at the framed photo on his bookshelf, taken when David was 10, all freckles and gap-toothed smiles. That boy was long gone. This was a man who hadn't returned a single voicemail in 2 decades, and now just weeks after the lottery, when he was suddenly eager to reconnect. Robert didn't confront him outright. Instead, he listened, agreed to the invitation, and hung up with a polite, "I'll see you on Christmas Eve." But inside, a storm was brewing. He could hear the dollar signs in David's voice, could feel the calculation behind the invitation. The confirmation came a few days later when Linda called. Her voice had aged, but still carried that smooth, persuasive tone he remembered from their marriage, the one she used when she wanted something expensive. She spoke of putting the past behind them, and then eased into a story about David's business troubles, investors breathing down his neck, possible collapse. Just $300,000 could set things right, she said, as casually as asking for a cup of sugar. Robert listened without interrupting, his mind already working. In the old days, he might have reached for his checkbook out of guilt or desperation for their approval. But now he decided to do something else, something calculated. The next day, he called David and told him a lie. He claimed he'd lost most of his lottery winnings in a cryptocurrency crash, Bitcoin, Ethereum, the works. He made it sound bad, very bad. The reaction was immediate and telling. David suggested that maybe it would be better if Robert didn't come for Christmas after all. "You probably need to focus on getting your finances sorted out," he said, his tone cooling by the second. That was all Robert needed to hear. Invitation was never about reconciliation. It was about the money. And now he had proof. He hung up the phone with a calm he hadn't felt in years. They thought they were dealing with the same man they abandoned 2 decades ago. They had no idea that the years alone had sharpened his instincts, hardened his resolve, and taught him the value of patience. Christmas Eve was still weeks away. But Robert was already planning his real gift to David and Linda, a gift they wouldn't see coming, and one they'd never forget. The morning after David's thinly veiled disinvitation, Robert Miller sat at his kitchen table, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands, staring out at the frost-coated street. The quiet wasn't lonely anymore, it was clarifying. In a single phone call, David had confirmed what Robert had suspected from the moment that unexpected Christmas invitation came in. This wasn't about family. It was about money. But Robert had learned something in his decades of rebuilding from nothing. When you want the truth, you don't confront it, you test it. That afternoon, he picked up the phone and dialed David's number. "Hey, son," he began, his voice deliberately warm. "I've been thinking about what you and your mom said, about the trouble you're in." And there was a pause on the line, then David's voice, cautious but curious. "Yeah, I mean, it's not as bad as she probably made it sound. You know how Mom worries?" Robert leaned back in his chair, letting the winter wind rattle the windows behind him. "Actually, I wanted to tell you some good news. Remember when I said I'd lost my lottery winnings in that cryptocurrency mess? Well, I managed to recover. Most of it, bought the dip, rode it back up. Turns out I did better than I expected." The silence on the other end lasted exactly 3 seconds. Robert counted. Then came the shift in tone, the sudden brightness. "Dad, that's fantastic. I'm so relieved. I was worried about you." The lie slid out of David's mouth so smoothly it almost sounded genuine. Robert knew what was coming next, so he let the silence stretch, forcing David to fill it. Sure enough, the younger man cleared his throat and said, "Actually, Dad, since things are looking up for you, I wanted to run something by you. It's a business opportunity. Time sensitive. Could change everything for me, for all of us." There it was. David laid it out. An investment in an AI technology startup, promising a 500% return in 18 months. He didn't say loan, and he didn't mention paying it back, just a chance to get in early. All it would take was $300,000, preferably before the end of the year. "Think of it as securing your grandchildren's future," he added, layering on the sentiment like icing on a stale cake. Robert kept his tone even. "That's a significant amount of money, David." "I know, Dad, but this is the kind of opportunity people dream about. Honestly, after all these years, I thought maybe this could be a fresh start for us." He was pressing every button: family, reconciliation, legacy, hoping one would unlock the vault. Robert didn't bite. "Let me think about it," he said at last. "I'll get back to you." He hung up, and Robert set the phone down beside his notepad. In the center of the page, he wrote one word in neat, accountant's handwriting: confirmed. This wasn't just a hunch anymore, it was proof. David and Linda's sudden interest in him had nothing to do with mending old wounds. They were circling, like hawks, because they believed there was something to take. The rest of the day, Robert worked the phone, but not with family. He called old contacts from his real estate days, business acquaintances who'd seen scams up close. Quietly, methodically, he began gathering information about David's supposed AI startup. Within hours, the picture was clear. It was a paper-thin shell, propped up with vague buzzwords and no real product. David's track record was littered with similar ventures each, one swallowing investor money and collapsing without a trace. By the time evening fell, Robert had a plan forming. He wouldn't just refuse their request. He'd make sure they faced the same cold truth they'd forced on him 20 years ago, that actions have consequences. And greed eventually collects its due. But this wouldn't be a confrontation over the phone. No, Robert decided. The stage would be set for Christmas Eve. They had invited him under the assumption they were luring in a mark. They'd discover instead they'd opened the door to the man they'd underestimated for far too long. He took a slow sip of coffee, the bitterness grounding him. For years he'd imagined different versions of seeing David against her for reunions. Heartfelt apologies, maybe even rebuilding some of what was lost. But tonight, as the December wind howled outside, Robert realized something profound. He Didn't need their apology. He didn't need their approval. What he needed was closure, and in just a few weeks, he'd get it trapped in a neat little package they would never forget. Over the next few days, Robert Miller's quiet little kitchen in Dayton became a war room. The notepad with confirmed written in bold letters stayed in the center of the table, surrounded by printouts, sticky notes, and a laptop that now held more damning information than David or Linda Carter could imagine. Robert had already confirmed. David's AI startup was a hollow shell, a few half-baked slideshows, a rented co-working desk in Columbus, and a trail of investors who had nothing to show for their money except broken promises. But it was a casual conversation with an old acquaintance from the Dayton Chamber of Commerce that opened the next and more disturbing chapter of his investigation. David's not the only one in that family running a racket, the man said, lowering his voice. Your ex-wife's been all over Facebook for the past year, claiming she's battling cancer, raising money for treatments, pulling in sympathy from half the county. Robert's brow furrowed. Cancer. He'd been married to Linda for 20 years, knew her better than most. He remembered every real doctor's appointment she'd ever had. She didn't handle pain well. She couldn't fake something like chemo. Or could she? That night, Robert searched her name on Facebook. The page was almost theatrical, dozens of posts showing Linda in staged hospital selfies, wrapped in scarves. Pale makeup carefully applied, captions dripped with pathos. Day 47 of chemo, your prayers and donations are what keep me going. Hundreds of well-meaning friends and strangers left comments with prayer emojis and offers of help. The fundraising link at the top showed thousands of dollars raised for treatment costs, not covered by insurance. Robert's stomach turned. He knew how hard cancer actually hit people: the fatigue, the hair loss, the endless bills. Here was Linda faking it for cash, but suspicion wasn't enough. Robert wanted proof. And in Dayton, proof often came through people you'd known for years. He picked up the phone and called Janet Morrison, an old friend who worked in the records department at St. Anne's Hospital. Robert had done the books for Janet's late husband's dental practice decades ago, back when life was simpler. When she answered, Robert didn't waste time. Janet, I know this is sensitive, but I think my ex-wife is running a medical fraud. I need to know if she's actually been treated here for cancer. There was a pause, then a low sigh. Robert, you know I can't just hand out patient records. I understand, he said. But people are giving her money they can't afford. Good people. She's lying. Every dollar is coming straight out of someone's grocery budget or their kid's college fund. Janet's voice softened. This stays between us. 20 minutes later, Robert sat in his car in the hospital's back parking lot, flipping through a folder of printouts. The truth was laid bare in black and white. Linda hadn't had a single oncology appointment, no chemotherapy treatments, no cancer diagnosis. In fact, her medical visits for the past 5 years consisted of annual checkups, a sinus infection, and one minor sprained wrist. Robert leaned back in the driver's seat, the cold air from the vents blowing against his face. It was one thing to suspect Linda could stoop low enough to poison his relationship with David, but this was stealing from people's compassion. It was ugly, even for her. Asterisk on the drive home. The December snow was starting to stick, dusting the streets like powdered sugar. Robert thought about all the strangers out there who believed they were helping a dying woman, sending checks with handwritten notes of encouragement. He thought about how many of them probably had their own struggles, yet still reached into their pockets because they believed in her story. By the time he reached his driveway, Robert knew exactly what he had to do. He placed Linda's medical records in a separate section of his growing evidence folder next to screenshots of her Facebook posts and comments from donors. The page after that held investor statements detailing David's unpaid debts. This wasn't just going to be a quiet refusal to hand over money anymore. Christmas Eve wasn't going to be awkward. It was going to be a reckoning. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the snow falling under the streetlights. For 20 years, Linda and David had operated under the assumption that Robert was weak, easy to dismiss, and easier to exploit. They'd spent those years building lies while he had spent them, building something far more dangerous: patience. That patience was about to run out. And when it did, Neither of them would be able to pretend they didn't see it coming. The next morning, Robert Miller sat at his kitchen table with the same discipline he once used to prepare tax audits, everything laid out in neat stacks. On one side, investor reports detailing David Miller's failed ventures and unpaid debts. On the other, Linda Carter's fraudulent cancer fundraiser, complete with screenshots, timestamps, and the hospital records Janet had slipped him the day before. This wasn't just family drama anymore. It was a criminal pattern. Robert intended to make sure the right people saw every piece of it. He started with the investors. Years ago, while managing rental properties, Robert had learned that money people keep long memories, especially when they've been burned. He pulled out the business registration paperwork for David's so-called AI startup, which listed a handful of private backers alongside a mid-sized venture capital firm in Columbus. His first call went to Mark Davidson, partner at that firm. When Davidson picked up, his voice sounded tired, almost irritated, till Robert dropped David's name. "You know where he is?" Davidson asked, the weariness evaporating into sharp interest. Robert didn't answer right away. "I know exactly where he is, and I have evidence you'll want to see proof of his current lifestyle. Social media posts of luxury dinners and designer purchases, all while claiming bankruptcy. And yes, I have his home address." Davidson's tone hardened. "We've been trying to serve him for months. Send me what you've got." One by one, Robert reached out to the other names on the list. There was Helen Martinez, who had invested $50,000 into David's solar breakthrough company that never materialized, and Tom Reynolds, who lost nearly $80,000 in what David had pitched as a revolutionary fitness app. Each call followed the same pattern: skepticism, then a rush of anger as Robert provided proof. By lunchtime, several of them had agreed to pool their resources into a joint lawsuit. They weren't just going after repayment, they wanted asset freezes, garnishments, and criminal charges. By 2 p.m., Robbo had emails confirming that the group's legal teams were coordinating. By 4 p.m., he had confirmation that emergency motions were being filed before the courts shut down for the holidays. If we move fast, Davidson told him, he could be served by Christmas Eve. Robert smiled into his coffee mug. Timing couldn't have been better if he'd scripted it himself. With David's legal reckoning in motion, Robert turned his attention to Linda. Her scam was more personal, not just because of their history, but because it preyed on good-hearted people. For this, he needed a different kind of ally: the press. He contacted Jenny Lawson, reporter at the Dayton Herald, whom he'd met years ago while volunteering at a community tax prep clinic. Jenny had a reputation for exposing charity fraud and consumer scams. Robert sent her a neatly organized file: Linda's Facebook posts, the GoFundMe transaction history, the hospital records. An hour later, Jenny called him back, her voice practically humming with energy. "Robert, this is airtight. Once my editor sees this, it's going to print. And just so you know, we're naming names." "That's the idea," Robert said. She asked if she could credit him as the source. He declined. "Anonymous is better. Let the facts speak for themselves." That evening, Robert sat at his kitchen table and opened his leather-bound planner. On Christmas Eve, he would arrive at David and Linda's home, exactly as invited, dressed like any proud father coming to reconnect. He would bring a small, wrapped box, not with money, but with something far more valuable: the knowledge that their years of deception had finally caught up to them in the hours leading up to that night. The lawsuits would be served. Jenny's article would go live online, and Linda's phone would explode with angry messages from donors demanding refunds. The carefully spun web they'd built over 2 decades would unravel in real time, right there at their holiday table. Robert closed the planner and looked out the window. Snow had begun to fall again, blanketing the streets of Dayton in a deceptive calm. For most people, the season was about forgiveness, warmth, and family. For Robert, this year's Christmas would be about justice, delivered with the same patience and precision he'd used to rebuild his own life. And when it was over, there would be no doubt left in David or Linda's minds. The man they had dismissed 20 years ago was gone, placed by someone they should have never underestimated. Christmas Eve arrived crisp and cold, the kind of Ohio winter night where Your breath hangs in the air like smoke, and the snow crunches under your shoes. Robert Miller stood in front of the mirror in his modest Dayton home, straightening the collar of his sweater. Nothing flashy, just warm and neat. He didn't want to look like a man flaunting money. He wanted to look like a father coming to. Dinner in the passenger seat of his Chevy Impala sat a small, gift-wrapped box. Inside was nothing of real monetary value, a pen and notepad set he'd bought from the office supply store. But its presence was deliberate. Let them think it. Might be something more. Let them hope. The subdivision where David Miller and Linda Carter lived was one of those newer developments. Rows of vinyl-sided houses, identical landscaping, oversized SUVs in every driveway. Robert parked at the curb and walked up the shoveled path, the house glowing with warm light, Christmas decorations twinkling in the windows. David opened the door with an enthusiasm that almost looked real. "Dad, you made it." Come in, come in." Behind him, Linda appeared, wearing a deep red sweater and that same polished smile she'd used on courtroom judges and realtors back in the day. "Robert," she said warmly, "so good to see you. You look prosperous." Robert stepped inside, taking in the scene. A table set for a feast, an enormous tree in the corner, glittering with ornaments. Designer handbags tossed casually. Over dining chairs, all the trappings of wealth, just not theirs. Dinner began with forced pleasantries and small talk. David spoke at length about his business ventures, slipping in subtle references to the AI opportunity as though planting seeds. Linda kept pouring wine and nodding along, occasionally steering the conversation toward Robert's recovery from his supposed cryptocurrency losses. Robert listened, smiled when appropriate, and said little. He kept glancing toward the clock, knowing the real show was about to start. It came just as Linda was serving dessert. Sharp, authoritative knock at the front door. Not the friendly tap of a neighbor bringing cookies. This was the knock of official business. David frowned, setting down his fork. I wasn't expecting anyone. Robert stayed seated as David went to the door. Through the frosted glass, Robert could see a man in a dark coat holding an envelope. "David Miller?" the man asked when the door opened. "Yes, you've been served." The man handed over the envelope and turned without another word, disappearing into the night. David stared down at the papers, his face draining of color. This can't be right. Linda rushed over, peering at the documents. "What is it?" "It's a lawsuit," David said, his voice shaking. "Multiple lawsuits." "The investors?" "They found me." Robert kept his expression carefully neutral, though every muscle in his body wanted to smile. "They're freezing my assets." David continued, flipping through the pages in disbelief. "They're demanding restitution, damages, interest." Linda's eyes darted to Robert. "This is terrible timing. Robert, maybe you could." She didn't finish the sentence. Her phone buzzed violently on the table, lighting up with notification after notification. She picked it up, her brow furrowing as she scrolled. "What the hell?" she whispered. Robert watched her face shift from confusion to panic. "There. Saying I faked cancer," she said, voice trembling. "Look at these comments, fraud scammer. There's even a news article." David snatched the phone from her and read aloud. "Dayton woman exposed for fake cancer fundraiser. Medical records confirm no treatments despite collecting thousands in donations." The silence that followed was heavier than any snowstorm. Robert set down his coffee cup and finally spoke, his voice calm and steady. "Seems the truth has a way of catching up to people." David turned on him, desperation creeping in. "Dad, listen, we can fix this. With your help, lawyers, PR people, we can make this go away." Linda leaned forward, her eyes pleading. "Robert, you said you had a surprise for us. Please tell me it's what I think it is." Robert stood, pulling his coat from the rack. "Oh, I've already given you your surprise," he said. "You're just opening it now?" He walked to the door as they called after him, their voices a tangle of panic and demands. But Robert didn't look back. The cold air hit his face as he stepped outside, the sound of their crumbling illusions fading behind him as he started the Impala and pulled away. Robert caught a glimpse of David's silhouette in the window. Watching him disappear into the winter night, For the first time in 20 years, Robert felt no weight, no lingering doubt. Just the deep, quiet satisfaction of a man who had finally delivered justice in person and right on time. The snow was still falling when Robert Miller pulled into his driveway that night, the headlights of his Impala carving two pale lines across the untouched white. Inside his warm, quiet home, he poured himself a fresh cup of coffee and sat by the window. Somewhere across town, David Miller and Linda Carter were choking on the taste of consequences. But Robert knew this was only the beginning. By morning, the fallout had spread like wildfire. The Dayton Herald's online expose about Linda's fake cancer fundraiser was at the top of the most read list. The headline left nothing to interpretation. Local woman's cancer story proven. False thousands raised under false pretenses. Below it, a side-by-side image compared Linda's staged chemo photos to her clean medical records. The comment section was brutal. Former donors were tagging one another, sharing screenshots of the refunds they were demanding. Others posted photos of their own cancer battles reel. Battlesan demanded she be prosecuted by 9 a.m. Robert's phone buzzed with a text from Jenny Lawson, the reporter who had broken the story. "It's blowing up. TV stations are calling. DA's office has requested all my evidence files." Robert texted back 2 words. "Good. Perfect." Meanwhile, David's side of the disaster was unfolding just as Robert had planned. The lawsuits served the night before weren't idle threats. They came with emergency motions that froze every account in David's name. His business credit cards were declined before noon. The leased SUV in his driveway was scheduled for repossession. One of David's investors went on local radio, recounting in detail how David had swindled her out of $50,000. "He promised returns that were impossible," she told the host. "He had dinners with us, met our kids, and the whole time he knew the company had nothing." Robert didn't have to imagine how the atmosphere in David and Linda's home felt. He'd lived through smaller versions of it during their marriage. The air would be heavy with blame. Linda's voice sharp and defensive, David pacing and cursing. Both of them looking for someone else to fix what they'd broken. That someone else used to be Robert, not anymore. By midday, Robert was running errands, buying groceries, picking up a new stack of books from the library when his phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number, but the voice was instantly recognizable. "Dad." David's tone was low, ragged. I don't know what to do. Everything's falling apart." Robert kept walking down the bread aisle. "I'm sure it is. They're coming after me from all sides. And Mom, she's getting death threats. People are posting her address online. You have no idea how bad it is." "Oh, I have an idea," Robert said evenly. "I told you once before, acts can't be bought, and love that comes with a price tag isn't love at all." There was a pause, and then David's voice took on a pleading edge. "If you could just help us get through the next couple of weeks, lawyers, PR, something, no?" Robert didn't raise his voice, but the firmness in that single word was enough to stop David mid-sentence. "You built this life, David. You made these choices. Now you live with them." The call ended awkwardly, David mumbling something about calling back later. Robert knew he wouldn't answer. That evening, Robert sat by his fireplace, the news still buzzing in the background. A local TV anchor announced that the district attorney's office had confirmed an active investigation into Linda's fundraiser, with potential charges including wire fraud and theft by deception. David's lawsuits had been consolidated into a single case involving 7 plaintiffs each, with enough evidence to sink him in court. Robert felt no gloating, no triumphant rush, just a deep, steady satisfaction. Justice was finally moving, not because of shouting matches or angry letters, but because the truth had been placed in the right hands. Out in the dark, the snow was still falling, soft and relentless, covering everything in white. To the casual eye, the city looked peaceful. But Robert knew that inside one house on the other side of town, the storm was only getting worse. For 20 years, they had treated him like a disposable man. Tonight, they were learning what it felt like to be the ones left out in the cold. 3 days after Christmas, the snow in Dayton had begun to melt into gray slush, revealing the hard, cold ground beneath. Robert Miller sat at his kitchen table, pen in hand, staring at a blank sheet of heavy cream stationery. He hadn't written a letter in years, but this one wasn't for reconciliation. It was for closure. For 2 decades, he'd carried the weight of unanswered questions, of what-ifs and maybes about his son David Miller and ex-wife Linda Carter. He'd wondered if there had been a turning point he could have salvaged, a conversation that might have changed the course of things. But the past few weeks had erased those doubts. The truth had been laid bare. He began to write. "David, I came to your home on Christmas Eve because you invited me. I left because I realized you didn't invite me for family, but for opportunity, and by opportunity, I mean money. The lawsuits and investigations you're facing now are not my doing. They are the result of years of choices you made without regard for others. Choices you defended, justified, and repeated until there was nothing left but consequence. I am not your savior. I am not your bank. And I am not a man you get to call dad only when it benefits you. That title is earned, not inherited. You and your mother once made it clear that my worth was measured in what I could provide. When I stopped providing, you stopped caring. This month proved that nothing has changed, but I have. I've learned that peace comes not from fixing broken people, but from walking away from them. You will not hear from me again. This is not anger, it's clarity. Hope you find yours." Robert Miller. He folded the letter, slid it into an envelope, and addressed it in neat block letters. But he didn't mail it, not yet. He wanted the timing to be perfect, when the storm around David and Linda was at its loudest, when the noise from lawyers and reporters made his silence even sharper. Over the next week, the headlines continued. Linda's GoFundMe account was frozen, and the district attorney announced formal charges of fraud and theft. David's creditors were granted permission to liquidate assets. His SUV was repossessed. In broad daylight, right there in his driveway, in front of neighbors and news cameras, Robert didn't watch the coverage with malice. In fact, he turned the TV off more often than not. Justice, he'd learned, didn't need an audience, it only needed to be certain. On the first Monday of the new year, Robert drove to the post office and dropped the envelope into the blue collection bin. No return address, no warning. Just the final word between father and son. That afternoon, his phone rang again from David's number. He didn't answer. It rang again and again. Eventually it stopped. Robert stepped out onto his porch and breathed in the sharp winter air. For the first time in 20 years, he felt entirely unburdened. The house's house stood quiet behind him, paid off and warm. The lottery money remained untouched in his accounts, waiting for the future he would choose, not one forced on him by guilt or manipulation. He thought of Helen, his late wife, and the way she used to tell him, "You can't pour from an empty cup, Robert. Fill your own first." Now his cup was full of peace, self-respect, and the kind of freedom that comes when you finally close a door without leaving it cracked. As the sun dipped behind the bare trees, Robert smiled to himself. The chapter was over, not with a bang, but with a clear, unwavering period. David and Linda could shout, scheme, and scramble all they wanted. They no longer had an audience in him. And for Robert, that was the sweetest justice of all. The first real snowstorm of the new year swept through Dayton the following weekend, covering the streets in a thick, muffled silence. Robert Miller sat by his front window, a mug of black, coffee warming his hands, watching the flakes drift under the streetlights. It was peaceful. It was more peaceful than any holiday he could remember in decades. No phone calls demanding money. No carefully worded guilt trips. No need to brace himself for the sting of false kindness. Just the hum of his furnace, the weight of his favorite flannel blanket, the knowledge that for the first time he had chosen his own peace over someone else's chaos. As he sat there, he realized something that he wished he'd known much earlier in life. It's not unkind to set boundaries, it's survival. For years, Robert believed that being a good man meant sacrificing without limit, that if you loved someone, you endured the hurt they caused, forgave faster than they apologized, and gave until you were empty. But life and this Christmas had taught him that love without respect is just control in disguise. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do for yourself is to walk away. He thought about all the viewers who might be watching this story unfold. Maybe you've had someone in your life who only came around when they needed something. Maybe you've kept the door open out of obligation, out of guilt. Or because you thought family was supposed to mean forever, no matter how much it cost you. Robert wanted you to know you are allowed to close that door. You are allowed to protect your heart, your peace, and your future. Saying no more is not an act of cruelty. It's an act of self-respect. And when you finally step back from people who've taken advantage for years, you might be surprised at how light life feels without their shadow over you. Robert wasn't bitter. In fact, he felt gratitude because every betrayal had taught him exactly what to value. The laughter of true friends who never asked for a dime. The quiet joy of a home that was truly his. The freedom to decide where. His time and money went without anyone's approval but his own. Looking out at the snow, he smiled. He knew David and Linda's lives were still in upheaval, the headlines still swirling, the lawsuits still churning. But that was no longer his storm to weather. His path was clear, and for the first time in a long time, it was his alone. And maybe that's the real gift in all of this, not revenge, not even justice, but the space to finally live life without someone else's demands dictating your every move. So if you take anything from Robert's story, let it be this: peace is priceless, and you don't need anyone's permission to keep it. Friends, if you've ever had to step away from toxic family members or people who used you for what you could give rather than who you are, I want to hear from you. What was the moment you knew it was time to walk away? How did it change your life? Share your story in the comments below. Your words might give someone else the courage to make the change they've been putting off for years. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We share real-life lessons like this all the time, stories about strength, self-respect, and reclaiming the life you deserve. Because somewhere out there, someone is still wondering if it's okay to put themselves first. And maybe your voice or Robert's story will be the one that finally lets them know the answer.